Everybody. Welcome to the second conversation in conjunction with Pulled Apart, hosted by USF's Thacher Gallery and the Engineering Program. I'm Glory Simmons, Gallery Director. As we begin our conversation today, I would like to acknowledge that the University of San Francisco Hilltop Campus sits on the unceded ancestral land of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, and that we all benefit from our connections to this place. We take this moment to recognize the cultural heritage that has survived colonization and genocide and honor Ohlone artists past, present, and future. Before turning it over to our speakers today, I'm going to just let you know about some upcoming events, introduce the exhibition and the speakers as well. So first, thank you to all of the artists, the engineering faculty and students, our collaborators, and the gallery team who have made Pulled Apart in these events possible. And thanks to our co-sponsors, the Department of Engineering and the Center for Research, Scholarly, and Artistic Excellence for co-hosting these events. This event is being recorded and will be available at the Thacher Gallery's YouTube channel. Don't miss the next conversation on Monday, April 5th from 5 to 6 p.m. with USF engineer Chris Brooks in conversation with artists Adam Chin and Carrie Hott. And don't forget to visit the exhibition online, and the link is in the chat. For more events, including a hands-on zine making program this Friday and a laser conversation that will feature Terry, Cynthia, and Adam on April 15th, visit the gallery's events page. In Pulled Apart, we experience works by artists whose practices include and examine computer technologies, mechanical devices, and larger infrastructures to reveal the seen and unseen systems that help shape society. Each artist approaches engineering in a unique way. And together, these 5 artists' works remind us of our complex relationship with the systems we've created. Unfortunately, today, Terry is ill and cannot make it, but she is part of the April 15th conversation, so I hope you'll join us then to hear more from her. And I'm happy to say that we have today Gail Wight and USF engineer Genna Smith to talk about the importance of tinkering in their work. And each will be introducing a little bit more about their specific projects, and then they will engage in a conversation and finish with Q&A. And we hope you'll use the Q&A to post your questions. So let me introduce Gail Wight. She has taught in the art practice program at Stanford since 2003, focusing on experimental media. Working primarily in photography, video, interactive media, and printmaking, Wight's work examines the interplay between art and biology. Her exhibition record includes dozens of solo exhibitions throughout North America and Great Britain, and her work has been collected by numerous institutions, including the Museum of Modern Art, Yale University, and Centro Andaluz de Arte Contemporáneo in Spain. Professor Genna Smith received her BS in electrical engineering with a double major in biology from the University of New Mexico and a PhD in electric engineering at Stanford. Her research projects seek ways to create low-cost medical devices and have included a point-of-care device for tuberculosis detection and a portable urinalysis device which can be used by untrained personnel. She is currently designing a blood-based test for early detection of atherosclerosis. As part of the online exhibition, she wrote a reflection on Terry Berlier's artworks. I'd like to quote a small section here, as I think it is applicable to all of the artist approaches and the conversation we'll be having today. As I looked past the big concepts of Berlier's work, I began to see more subtle lessons and was drawn in further. A key mantra to my teaching is learn to be comfortable being uncomfortable. Rarely do impactful ideas or inventions come from a place of comfort. They come from pushing oneself in directions that are new and unexplored. With this, I'd like to turn it over to Genna to speak about her work.
Great. Thank you, Gloria, for that introduction. I have some slides that I will share. Great. So as Gloria mentioned, my name is Genna. I am an assistant professor in the brand new Department of Engineering at USF. I myself am new to USF. And, in speaking with both Terry and Gail, we were trying to find sort of links in our work. And one thing that was clear was that we're all very clear tinkerers. And so I will describe some of my projects and also describe sort of how tinkering comes into my projects. So my research, as you heard a few of the projects that Gloria listed, it's very much at the intersection of engineering and biology, and in particular, medicinally focused biology. I do a lot of low-cost diagnostics. I do a few more high-end diagnostics. And I'll talk about sort of 3 projects really briefly and talk about how tinkering comes into each one of those. And actually, before I even start with the projects themselves, when I was thinking, when we were all talking about how we tinker, sort of for a living, I got thinking to the broader idea of tinkering. And, for me, in my mind, all engineers are tinkerers. It's just a matter of what we're tinkering with. But we're all really fooling around, with physical phenomena and different materials and different tools. And it's just really the specifics of those tools and materials that we use that define our discipline of engineering. And so I thought I'd give you just a few examples of how I tinker and the sort of materials and tools that I tinker with. And you'll see that they change based on the project that I do, especially since I work across disciplines. So this first project I'm calling Macroscale physical tinkering. So large scale, tinkering with physical objects. And in this project, I was creating fake bladders. So bladders made out of plastic. And we created them as a target for medical imaging. So I've done a lot of optical medical imaging, so imaging different parts of your body using light. And for those, we always wanted a test target, something we could image time and time again with new technologies and sort of compare how our technologies were working by imaging the same object over and over again. And so the challenge was to sort of tinker my way through creating this 3D plastic bladder that still had the properties of tissue that I would see using my medical imaging modality. And if you didn't know, your bladder is actually made up of several layers of tissue. In particular, some of the layers are really, really thin. And so the challenge became, how do I create really thin layers of plastic in this 3D bladder shape? And so I was already familiar from previous projects with a process called spin coating. And there's this little animation here showing you, but essentially if you put liquid on a surface and then you spin that surface really fast, that liquid spreads out over that surface in a really uniform thickness. And then how fast that object spins dictates how thin that layer is. And so I was already familiar with this process of spin coating and using liquid plastics, so plastics that start off as a liquid, and then as you heat them up, they harden. I was already familiar with the process of creating these flat layers of plastic, of thin layers of plastic. And so I wanted to see if I could create 3D shapes with these. So, the first thought is, let's just 3D print. Sorry, I just realized maybe that animation wasn't showing. Let's 3D print these bladder shapes. So I 3D printed 2 halves of a bladder. And the thought was, if I put liquid into half of a bladder and then I spin that 3D shape, maybe I can get the material to spread out evenly in a thin layer over that shape. Long story short, it failed miserably the very first time I did it. It turns out that this vacuum that holds your substrate, so this like flat surface, it's held by a vacuum that suctions it to the surface as it spins. And it turns out that that vacuum really only works if your surface is really flat and really smooth, which if you've ever 3D printed objects, it's not that way. And so I was, sort of spinning these 3D printed objects and they were flying all over. And so I had to do a lot of tinkering to try to find the solution, try different processes. Maybe spin coating wasn't the answer. Try different materials. I tried 3D printing different materials. I tried different tools to sort of even out the surface, to smooth the surface on the bottom of my 3D printed parts. So there was a lot of sort of macro scale building and testing new processes with my hands. And ultimately, the solution ended up being simply super gluing a really flat, smooth surface, so a silicon wafer, a really flat, smooth surface to the bottom of my 3D printed parts, and then putting that on the spin coater. And I found that the super glue was robust enough to hold those two pieces together, even as they spun really fast. And so this I think of as sort of typical tinkering, right? I have large things that I'm working with my hands and trying to create something. But working in the field of biology, I also do a lot of what I call microscale tinkering. So as Gloria mentioned, I'm currently working on a method for detecting disease from a blood sample alone. So if you have, say, a tumor in your body, the typical way to characterize that tumor is to cut you open, take a small piece of that tumor, and then analyze that small piece of tumor. I'm trying to work on a way where just using components present in your blood, we can also do disease detection. In particular, I'm working with the pieces of DNA that are just free floating in your blood. It's called cell-free DNA. And there's a lot of tinkering that also has to happen at this microscale level. You know, I'm trying to create little pieces of DNA that will bind to a patient's DNA. And if they bind, they will tell me if that patient has a certain disease. And so there's a lot of, iterations of trying different chemicals and different pieces of DNA and really tinkering at the microscale. And so I very much consider this still tinkering, even when it comes to biological components. It's just that the materials that I'm working with look very different. So instead of large scale 3D printed parts, I'm working with these tiny tubes of liquid that basically all look the same because we can't see DNA with our naked eye. And so I have to be very careful to properly label all of these little tiny tubes. And so it's tinkering with a purpose, with good documentation. But nonetheless, I still feel like this is sort of a process of tinkering my way through biology. And then the last example I will give is what I'm going to call digital tinkering. So now there's nothing physical about what I'm going to do. And for the sake of time, I won't really describe in depth what this project is. But over here, I have a medical image. And there's not a lot of quantitative information from this medical image. You can see that these 4 layers here have different brightnesses, but it turns out that these brightnesses are somewhat misleading. They don't actually tell me as much information about the sample as I would like. And so I, instead of trying to physically manipulate the imaging system, I worked on computer algorithms and understanding how to model the processes in those medical imaging technologies to then create this image that you see here on the right, which it turns out has much more useful information from a medical standpoint. And all of that was done in the computer. And this is sort of, in some ways, the truest form of tinkering because I have complete freedom, right? I don't have to worry about using up all of my blood sample, right? I can change this image 1,000 different ways and then still have my original image. I don't have to worry about breaking anything. There's no tools to break. There's nothing to break. So I think, thinking of tinkering both as a physical and as a digital process is something that, Gail, Terry, and I actually all sort of have in common. All right, I know that was a whirlwind, sort of a very brief intro to the work that I do. And with that, I will pass it off to Gail to introduce her work.
That was fabulous. Thank you, Genna. And thanks, Glory, for this invitation. This is really fun. We've had some great conversations. I am going to share my screen and everyone will shout at me if I get this wrong, I hope. Hopefully you are seeing the work that's in the show. These are the anatomies. They were made for a show called The History of Disarticulation. And they are very much about pulling toys apart and laying them out in a manner that's similar to biology charts and the ways in which we pull apart the human body in order to understand it. And how this seems to be our relationship to the world, to take things apart, and play them out and try to discover what their inner workings are doing. I love that these things all have some particular mannerism of the animal that becomes forefront. I was around this time thinking very much about this process of pulling things apart or disarticulation. But following this, I started thinking about things that are already pulled apart and how to put them back together in a way that might be inspiring or offer something new or fresh perspective. So I'm going to talk about a few pieces. The first is this one. It's a piece called Ground Plane, and it started with a visit to Professor Liz Hadley's lab. She's a paleobiologist at Stanford, and she's studying deep time. And I really needed to wrap my brain around deep time and understand what it was. The bones are all super tiny. You can see they're about the size of a thumbnail, and she has thousands of them. She literally handed me the keys to her lab while she was on sabbatical. And for months, I just photographed all of the bones in her collection, just kind of mesmerized by these things that she'd found in the landscape. We think of these sort of barren landscapes where you find these, but where everyone is sitting, wherever you are tonight, the ground beneath us is filled with this history. So I wanted to talk about these somehow. So I ended up with these proof sheets, and how do I put them back together to create something that talks about deep time? The forms that came to mind were crystalline structures and snowflakes and mandalas, because they embody both a timelessness and an ephemerality, which is deep time to me, this sort of timeless phenomena and an ephemerality of constantly disappearing. I reassembled the bones into these 12 images based on snowflakes and mandalas. And this will give you an idea of the scale. Unfortunately, with all of the work that I'm going to show you tonight, detail is key. Detail is a big part of it, and it's really hard to share that with you. This is a small detail of one of those that hopefully gives you some idea of the sort of hyper real, super high res definition to each of these, so that hopefully I'm drawing your attention to these very tiny, minuscule bits that are sort of tossed aside in life. The next piece, I gathered dead flies from my studio. And I was keeping them in this little petri dish, and they were dry, they fell apart, but their wings sort of held together, which makes a lot of sense. I ended up with the pile of wings, and I wanted to make something gorgeous out of them, because when we look at dead flies, we go, ugh, right? And I wanted to make something that makes us go, ah, and that we would appreciate flies in some other way. So I built a piece called the hexapodarium, making every kind of flower I could think of out of fly wings. I did this in Photoshop, taking each fly wing, each high resolution photograph, and then twisting and bending and turning and overlap and repeating it until I came up with approximations of however many flowers this is. It's something like somewhere between 60 and 80 flowers. Yes, so this is the hexapodarium, based on an herbarium, but critters with 6 hexapods. This next work was based on a shore near my house that's covered with seaweed, tons of seaweed there, and it piles up in big mounds on the beach and dries and is super smelly. So again, something that makes people go, ugh. What I did was I gathered all that seaweed that was drying up on the beach, and I made copepods out of it, which are these ubiquitous creatures that live in every body of water on the planet. And I wanted to sort of bring that seaweed back to life again, make something celebratory out of this thing that was torn out of its natural existence and dying, or it is part of its natural existence. But so here are a bunch of these. They go on and on. Again, what's a little bit difficult to show you is that these prints, they're super high resolution scans that are then assembled into these copepods, and they can be printed quite large. And they have, here's a close-up of one of them. They maintain a lot of their three-dimensionality. So they have this real touchable quality where they seem like they're really there on the page, but they aren't. They're no longer part of the life of a seaweed. Another work comes from sand, again, something that's underfoot, but filled with all sorts of microscopic treasures. In any little bundle of sand, you will probably find a bunch of tiny shells. So I went to my local beach, which has no obvious tiny shells, but collected a bunch of sand and came home with gazillions of little shells. And then I started assembling them. So this one image is 5 inches square, and I just made a ton of boxes and started sort of outpouring my training in art history and design through these little shells, just revisioning those things over and over again in this sort of obsessive way, trying to find a sort of shared language. So here's a subset of them, and I ended up with about 64 of these, with some bigger ones. You can see right in the middle there might be some things you'll recognize. There's Stonehenge right in the middle. There are sine waves and the golden mean, and there's some art history for the artists who might be here. Tara Donovan and Sol LeWitt and Donald Judd and things like that in here. I recently revisited this process of making very tiny things out of tinier things, and taking more dead shells, making drawings of diatoms, taken really from Ernst Haeckel's drawings in the late 1800s of diatoms, using those. And here's another one. I've finished 2 of these, and I have 2 more that are in process. Here are those 2 together. And then lastly, there's this work. This is an homage to abalone. California has 7 species of abalone, and it's guessed that 2 of them are probably extinct, although that hasn't been declared absolutely, but all 7 of them are endangered, and they're endangered only from overfishing, not from habitat loss or climate change or anything. It's simply from overfishing, which is especially tragic. So I turned to this art of kintsugi, which is this beautiful tradition in Japan of fixing a broken item, ceramic item, with this process of a natural epoxy, a resin, and gold. So celebrating the brokenness and the fallen apartness of something. I first made these small tests, just seeing if the concept would work out, and then realized that I really needed to make a monster in sort of fixing the abalone. So I decided I would build this giant abalone shell until abalone came off of the endangered species list, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. But I had to stop it last year because it in turn began to break and fall apart under its own weight. So just a little bit on ways in which taking things that have already fallen apart and trying to put them back together. So Genna, can I ask you questions?
Absolutely, as long as I can ask you questions as well.
I'm really curious. I always think about this in the world of science, how tinkering has its limits, right? You can tinker just so much, but there are sort of ethical bounds that are really essential beyond which you can't tinker. And how do you navigate those boundaries for yourself?
Yeah, so I'll start off. Actually, I think your screen is still shared if you want to.
Oh God, I'm so thank you.
No problem.
I need. Thought I was out of there. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, luckily I work in a space where I don't often come against those ethical bounds too often. One of the reasons that I like working with blood samples is because I don't have to push that as much, right? If I'm working with a live living specimen, then that's a whole different story than taking a blood draw from someone. And I think part of my inspiration for that comes from the fact that, in low resource areas, it's usually not accessible, those places where you're pushing those bounds, right? Surgery is not something that's nearly as accessible as a simple blood draw. So I think I'm in some ways sort of fortunate that I don't push those bounds as much in the engineering work that I do. But they definitely do exist. And I think it's just a constant sort of checking of yourself and staying in communication with your peers and having sort of, self checks as well as group checks about the work that you're doing. Because I'm sure you do this as an artist, right? You get so engrossed in your work that sometimes it's hard to see the outside perspective of what you're doing. So I think it's important as engineers to ask for outside checks of what we're doing and make sure that we're not accidentally crossing those ethical boundaries simply because we're so engrossed in our work.
That's great. Yeah, there probably should be more ethical checks on artists. Definitely are fewer. I felt that the cell-free DNA work that you're doing is a perfect example of sort of improving upon a process that did take something apart in this very severe and stressful way in order to check a tumor. And now you're developing this incredibly minorly invasive way of doing that, if invasive at all. It's really extraordinary.
Yeah, I very much enjoy trying to do those minimally invasive processes, especially like I said, because in those low resource areas, you just don't have the tools to do those invasive processes correctly and safely. So if we can develop more tools that are minimally invasive, by their very nature, they're just more widely accessible. Can I turn it back to you though now? So you just mentioned that you thought there should be more ethical checks on artists. Where do you see those happening? Like as a non-artist, maybe I can't imagine where I would put an ethical check on an artist, but what are your ideas on that?
Oh, well, then to talk about that, I'd have to talk about a lot of the unethical things I've seen artists do, which maybe I shouldn't be talking about publicly. But there's self-harm that happens in the arts, I think frequently, which is very distressing. And there has been use of live animals and things like that that's highly questionable, just obviously wrong. It happens. I don't know that it happens so much anymore. I think that we're getting better at learning those boundaries, but I know the 60s were pretty rampant in pushing the boundaries of what could be art and went too far plenty of times.
Out of curiosity, is there any governing body against that? So like for engineering and medical tests, right, we now have this IRB and you have to go through all these processes. If you want to use live animals, it's a whole long process and training that goes into it. There's nothing similar for artists, is there?
No,
Okay.
there isn't. Yeah. And not that I would will that to be, because sometimes I think it's really important for artists to push those boundaries. There isn't really a lot of other place in society to do that. But okay, so I'm gonna veer to a conversation that we had in our pre-conversations when we were talking about tinkering, because there's privilege in that, right? There's privilege in being able to not be underneath the aegis of a board that's overseeing the work that you do. But I also think that I want to come to a concept of privilege in your work, because you are working on a lot of low cost medical devices, and tinkering is something that I always think comes out of a sort of like a 19th century gentleman's, privilege to spend their days in their laboratory, playing with this or that. And it's not something that most people can do in their daily lives, to tinker. It feels like a privilege. And so I find it fascinating that you are making the time to do that specifically for low income solutions to things. And I'm wondering if you have found that easy to do and you found support for that.
That's so, I guess it didn't come up in our pre-conversations. That's so interesting. For me, I almost think of tinkering as the opposite of like a gentlemanly thing, right? Because my idea of tinkering is, me sitting in my, I don't have a garage now, but when I was growing up, me sitting in my garage, taking apart a TV that was thrown out, right? Something from the trash, and, taking it apart and seeing all of the connections inside of it and ripping the capacitors out and seeing the blown capacitors in the TV. And so, the tools and materials that I initially was introduced to with tinkering was garbage. So for me, I think tinkering almost is the low cost solution for people that don't have, these more expensive tools. And so for me, it was a natural progression from tinkering to low cost solutions. I feel like when I'm
great.
Yeah, so I feel like maybe we see tinkering in sort of very different lights, and sort of maybe our introductions to tinkering were a little bit different.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I used to teach an art and electronics class, and I collected a lot of images from specifically early electronics experiments. And most of them were from Europe, but I have a few from Japan and China, in which experimenters, and these were all like upper class gentlemen, who would do these experiments using live people. Like, so they would like rent an orphan for the day and, cover the, have them hang over a barrel of tar and have feathers be attracted to them via electrical generation. It was like, ah! So it was, a part of this lecture I would give of, like, here's how this fits into history. We're playing with electricity, but it used to be a very sort of privileged thing to do. And you could actually, the first electricity in the United States primarily went to the wealthy rather than to hospitals or public works, that kind of thing, which is the opposite in places like Sweden. And like the Rockefellers had live girls who would wear electric light dresses and stand in their hallways and greet people. So, that's a deadly sort of tinkering. Anyhow, yeah, I distracted myself. But yeah, I think, but you're right. There is also like having to solve a problem when you don't have the tools. There's another aspect of tinkering that comes into the low income point of view there. Like when you don't have the means and you need to have a solution, tinkering is the way my dad did it in his basement. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so I
Yeah.
think that's where, where I think I fit in is I'm making these low cost solutions because really that's what tinkering to me is. It's creating something out of the bare minimal, which, by its very nature is low cost.
Right. That's great. So is the scientific community supportive of that, or say the grant community in the science world supportive of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a subset, of the engineering community. You definitely still, you need those high precision instruments, which you can't make out of these low cost solutions. So there's a lot of that, but there is definitely a field, sort of like a maker community within the engineering, where we're trying to create these lower cost solutions, especially in education as well, right? The ability to teach these types of experiments, so to do those static electricity experiments, to do them in a variety of settings, there's a big push towards making lower cost educational tools as well.
Oh, that's cool. That's really great.
Can I turn it to a question for you? So you do a lot of both physical and digital tinkering, but I'm curious where the inspiration for some of your tinkering comes from. For example, I would never think to take pictures of fly wings and turn them into flowers. Where does that inspiration come from?
So honestly, the inspiration comes from people like you. I made notes here like, ask Genna about the layers of the bladder. And what is optical coherence tomography? Honestly, it's, conversations with scientists. I've always just really thrived. So chatting with Liz Hadley about deep time. What in the world is deep time, and how do you wrap your head around it? And how in the world, it's so abstract. You can't honestly have a feel for that, can you? And she really does. She can talk smoothly about eras and epochs the way somebody might talk about, their favorite pasta recipe or something. And I don't quite, the fluency is stunning to me because it's a very abstract concept. Most of us can't remember last week, never mind think of in millions of years. So it is really through conversations with scientists. So, that work was inspired by Liz, and reading, I read a lot of, pop sci stuff about climate change and that sort of thing. And it's the ideas coming out of science that are just deeply inspiring to me as an artist. I think scientists are really striving to understand life as it is and solve the mess we've made of things and make a better world, heal and fix. And I'm really incapable of doing that. So, gluing a abalone shards together is the best I can do, but I'm, trying to take a
Did you ever have hopes at a younger age to be a scientist, or did you always know that art was your calling and you found the inspiration for your art through science?
I want to hear the answer to you from you about that question as well. But the answer is yes and yes. I always wanted to be an artist because my big sister was an artist and I just wanted to be whatever she was. And my grandfather was very creative and, not as a vocation, but as a hobby. And I loved that visual world. I was really smitten by it. But I also spent hundreds of hours on my belly staring into tide pools. And, Jacques Cousteau was my hero. So if somebody had told me as a little girl in the 60s that I could be a marine biologist, maybe that's where I would be right now. But that never came up as an option. And artist, I think, was like, oh, that's nice, Yeah. So here I am. But yeah, I think, both have always been enticing. How about you?
Yeah, so I actually originally wanted to be a doctor. I found, the idea of healing people so compelling. But then I found that that was not my calling. And I found that because I was trying to learn how to give an IV. My mom was actually fairly sick when I was younger, and we were trying to do, some home care, and there was trying to learn how to do some IVs, and I passed out. Um, and then I also shadowed a doctor once, and I didn't faint, but I very nearly did. So clearly, the sight of the blood and everything that comes with being a doctor was not for me. And so then I took the approach of, if I'm not going to be a physician, is there a way that I can still contribute to the medical community from a different way? And that's how I found, engineering for the medical community.
Wow, that is such a lovely story. That's really beautiful. I like that.
So yeah, it's come in a roundabout way. But I will say I started engineering as well because my older brother was doing it. That's how I declared my major in engineering was, oh, that's what he's doing. I'll try
There
that.
you
We'll see how
go.
it goes.
Big brothers and big sisters, good influencers. That's great.
Can I
So,
ask? Oh, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, I know I can't see questions from the audience, but I think you can. And I didn't know if we should turn to that.
We can, and we also have some questions, some like pre-questions from the audience, but let's see. So there's one for you here. So it says, Gail, your work draws from many different subcategories in biology, just some being neurology, marine biology, microbiology, and notably slime mold. Would you say that your artistic relationship differs with each of the various aspects of biology that you work in?
Yeah, yes, because I don't really work in biology, I work in art. So it's a struggle for me to learn about slime mold and then learn about deep time and then, learn about something else, this or that. So it's always, I think I don't know, the playfulness of it is getting to learn about those things. But yeah, it's a big mind shift. I don't know that there's and the same is true with the art making tools themselves. I had to learn kintsugi to make the fix, but I'm not going to be making kintsugi with every piece I do henceforth. So so each of those things is sort of in and of itself. So yeah, there's definitely a mind shift between each of those places, but they resonate with each other internally somehow. I think everything we do becomes part of this big mucky painting.
How do you typically learn about, I mean, you seem, in some ways you seem more well-versed in science than I am.
That is not true.
But how do you go about learning this? Is it mainly you find someone and you talk with them, or how do you even choose like which, subset of biology you want to work in next? And how do you go about learning those subjects?
It started out with family illness and really wanting to understand mental illness. So those things are really powerful, right? You have a family member that's not well and you don't understand and it's scary. And so it started out there, but that was a rabbit hole into what is an illness and how has that changed over time and how do we discover the treatments to these things? And, that tinkering right there is just mind blowing to me, how brave people are who tinker with life and how gutsy, I don't know, how terrifying that is at times. I think we did talk in one of our conversations, like head transplants are definitely out. We don't do head transplants. There are limits, some good ones. Yeah, so I don't know, I distracted myself totally. But yeah, throw something in front of me that has to do with life and what life is about and how we got here and how we define wellness. And I think over time I've turned to other animals on the planet that are here with us. I think people love to think about people, but we've got to start thinking about the other things that are here with us, or we're doomed. We really, you know, there's a insect genocide going on that's terrifying, and that will kill us, and we don't understand that. And, you know, it's hard to save a mosquito for the mosquito's sake, so we have to convince people that it's for their own sake, but it's hard, you know. So yeah, so my interests have really turned toward extra human biology.
Have you seen that reaction from some of your work? So for instance, with, these fly wings, things that, people would never think, are pretty. Do you see sort of a shift in a mindset of, thinking away from people towards these insects when you have the ability to turn them into something beautiful?
Not very often. This is where I'm very jealous of your field and what you do, because you send art out into the world and you hope it triggers something in someone's mind that eventually turns into something approximating an idea you'd love for them to have, but who knows, you know. But you must be able to see the fruits of your labor changing things, right? I mean, hopefully cell-free DNA testing will become a thing, right?
Yeah, I will say it is a long haul. I don't think you can go into medicine ever and hope for immediate results, especially with all of the approval processes. And, we have a lot of ethical things in place, which for a good reason, but progress is slowed because of those. So, these projects that I'm working on now, I have a hope maybe in 10 years, I'll see them being implemented. So there's
Right.
definitely a level of patience that needs to come with creating medical solutions.
That's amazing.
I want to ask, let's see, we had another student question that I really loved. What does it mean to study experimental media? And how does it affect you in your way of thinking? For example, has it changed your mindset or how you view things in your everyday life?
I got to make up the title experimental media for my area at Stanford. Luckily, it was called a digital art or something when I got there, and that seemed very short-sighted. So I changed it to experimental media because I feel like we race through life and there are all kinds of fascinating mediums and media that artists have used, people have used in various fields that get discarded along the wayside before they're really I don't know, they're really engaged with or grappled with as artists. So Super 8 film is a thing of the past, right? Or letterset presses are just amazing, but they're just tossed out everywhere. There is one in San Francisco. We're lucky to have a place that does letterpress here in the city. But things like that just disappear. And now that we have these new technologies, nobody has had a chance to see what kind of hybrids with old technologies might be possible. Nobody's done very many digital and letterpress hybrid projects because it's not really possible, or Super 8 film and video mashups, it's not really possible to do that anymore. So, or at least it's not easy. So, and to me, anything can be an experimental media. Like Vic Muniz makes the most amazing images out of pasta and chocolate and dust, so those I think are extraordinary media that artists could delve into to make art with, and anything, it's the anything goes category. So, yeah.
I love this idea of bringing sort of old-fashioned things back to life, in the eyes of our modern technology. It's something that I try to do often, and there's a professor at Stanford who does it like beautifully in terms of taking old toys and understanding the inner workings of those old toys and then applying them to engineering problems. So one example is if you're familiar with a centrifuge, you like spin things really fast and anything that's really dense gets pulled down to the bottom. And so anytime you do a blood test, you almost always centrifuge the blood first. But they're big and they're bulky and they require lots of power and they're super expensive to get nice ones. But so what he's created is, I don't know if you ever played with the toys where it's got like a disc in the middle and then strings and you can like pull it. And
A
this,
thaumatrope, yeah.
yeah. And this disc in the middle spins really fast. And so this professor out of Stanford created a way to put a blood sample in that disc,
Oh,
and then it's like a hand-powered centrifuge.
oh, that's so amazing.
Yeah, so these old toys that, we sort of just think of as toys and there's nothing really useful out of it. I think there's something really beautiful in understanding the mechanics behind those and pulling them in, especially because things aren't made with the same quality, typically nowadays that they were there then. So their toys are so robust and they're
Right.
so, physically indestructible that they're perfect for these places where that's exactly what you need in your medical devices, is something physically indestructible.
That's so great.
Yeah, so I love the idea of bringing the historical part and seeing what we can pull from that with our modern eye.
Yeah, that's a perfect example, because all those things still have rich promise to them. They're not just old and dusty, they're filled with life. We've moved on to new things, but it doesn't mean we have to discard everything old.
Especially because, like I said, those old things are typically so robust, right? So if you
Yeah.
need something that operates, in any situation, look to the older toys. They're going to last much longer than these newer modern toys.
Yeah. And they also just make our minds work in ways. For instance, I teach with Paul DeMarinis at Stanford, and he used to have a class on uh, archaeology. I can't remember the name of it, but it's media archaeologies, I think. And he built a camera obscura out of one of Stanford's golf carts that drive around campus, and students would get in it and go for a ride around campus, laying inside of this dark tank, seeing a sort of live photographic image upside down inside this live camera obscura. And it's just such an inspiring experience to have, that everybody who emerged from the golf cart was kind of like had these aha moments. Really wonderful.
That sounds amazing. I wish I could do that. I've built little camera obscuras, like with a shoebox. I've built the mini
Yeah,
ones, but the idea of going like around campus live sounds amazing.
yeah, it was really fun.
We have lots of students I know listening in. So I want to ask you then, how do you determine if an idea is worth pursuing? And sort of how do you deal with projects that don't go the way that you're hoping that they do?
This is a good one for you to answer too. um it's it's less risky for me. I think I have lots of ideas that are on the shelf, and sometimes I take them down and dust them off, and I remember why they're on the shelf and I put them back. um but I think an idea needs to have, it's like you don't miss an event, or you don't miss an important date with a friend for one reason, right? You miss it because of a couple of reasons, or there's always a couple of things that make things go wrong. And it should also be a couple of things that make things go right. Like, an idea needs to have something that's compelling to me, and it needs to have something that's meaningful in the world, and it needs to have some kind of promise materially, or something, that some way of coming into existence. I could have a beautiful idea that means something to me and might mean something to the world, but if I can't realize it, then it's pointless. um, yeah, anyhow. How about for you? Which is, it's, I think, much more important in your case.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's similar though, right? It has to be something that resonates with me. These projects are always long term. So if it's not something that you are truly interested in, a problem that you are truly interested in solving, I don't know that it's worth starting that problem. And I think a lot of it, I think a lot of it is just trying. And so I think I have lots of ideas, and I whittle them down sort of to the ones that have meaning to me, and then I do a lot of tinkering and I see which ones hold the most promise. And I think this is one of the values of tinkering and engineering, is especially at the low cost level, so not at the gentleman's level, but at the low cost level of tinkering, is it gives you a space to explore different projects and start to get senses for what things actually hold promise and which ones don't. And I think the other thing with tinkering is that you're, how do I want to say this? You're working in a space where you don't know where you're going. And I think that, having that freedom both to fail, but also working in a space where you don't know what the answer is going to be, forces you to have this open mind of, looking for interesting phenomena that maybe you weren't expecting to happen. discovering something by accident, accidentally making something interesting while you were trying to tinker towards another solution. So yeah, I think there's a lot that goes into picking a project, but I really do like the aspect of tinkering at the beginning to figure out if it's something worth pursuing, while also staying open-minded to the paths that that tinkering may open. Right? I'm sure we've both experienced this where you're trying to build something, but through that process of trying to build it, a new path sort of presents itself, and that ultimately ends up being the path that you go.
Right. Yeah, I think it's really important to leave yourself open to those byways that end up being, I don't want to say highway. That was a bad pun. I didn't mean to do that. But yeah, leaving yourself open to those. And also, we talked a little bit about this earlier, leaving yourself open to failure, trying something that maybe is a bad idea and having it fail miserably. And you learn something from that, right? I feel for students who have to make these decisions about which projects to commit to under time constraints that, once you sort of reach the level of grad school and professional work, you have more time at your hands and you're not under these sort of tight deadlines that students are with quarter and semester projects. But for students having to make those decisions quickly, it's important to realize how critically valuable all the failure is when you choose the wrong thing and it doesn't go well. There's a lot in there that will inform you for the rest of your life, right?
I completely agree. I am, as odd as it is to say, I'm a big fan of failure.
Yeah, it's, I don't know, there are a whole bunch of adages out there, right? If you never fail, it means you never tried or whatever it is. But yeah, it's
As
critical.
cliche as they sound, they come from a place of honesty, right?
Yeah.
We've got a few more minutes. I want to remind audience members that we do have our Q&A open in case anyone has some, urgent pressing questions that they really want to know about Gail's work, about the processes that she takes, about the intersection of our work, tinkering in general. I just want to remind people that that's open. If not, then maybe I will ask another sort of pre-student question. I just had one. Oh, right. Okay. So you do a lot of sort of crossover between art and technology. So maybe not, what people traditionally think of as, traditional medium, right? You say you work in these experimental medium. So what do you think that art with technology or art in these experimental mediums can express that pieces without it can't?
That's a tough question. Whoever asked that, that's a really good question. I want to say nothing because I want to believe that a painting can say anything that needs to be said, but I think it's more of reaching a broader audience. Not every person is interested in looking at painting, but I believe painting can say everything that needs to be said, and it's the most traditional medium. But there is a broader audience that's interested in, say, instead of looking at painting, watching a video or listening to an audio piece or playing with an app or something like that and having this other experience. Or other mediums that have been kind of set by this roadside, like bookmaking, which is really an older tradition, but is more part of contemporary art than it used to be. So there are things like that that I feel various mediums reach a wider audience.
Maybe not so much what the message can contain the same things, but maybe it reaches a broader group of people, that same message.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely easier to make a work that's about the passage of time, say, if you're working with a time-based medium. It's easier to do that than it would be with painting, which might need a series of paintings to talk about the passage of time, maybe, but it's easier, quicker in a lot of ways to talk about certain topics with technology.
Great. We've got a great question from one of our audience members. So it says, Gail, I found your art to be ingenious and that you sometimes use mundane things to create something beautiful. It seems that doing such is invaluable as a skill. Is it something you had to train, or do you naturally find the beauty or potential beauty in such things?
I'm blushing. Thank you. Thank you. No, I think there was a real shift when I realized people think about people too much, and we need to think about animals. I then started realizing that our relationship to animals is really twisted. There are a whole bunch of animals that we consider pests or trash or dinner or just clothes or whatever it is. We don't really look at them as beings on their own that have the right to be here, the same right that we do. And so I really started obsessing over the things that are literally underfoot, the stuff we ignore, the sort of detritus of the world that's there. I mean, the time beneath our feet thing, I just never get over once I started thinking about deep time and how much of it is like right underfoot all the time. And yet we just step on it, drive on it every day. Our roads are made out of old ocean beds and things like that. It's just kind of stunning. So no, it doesn't come naturally. It was forcing myself to slow down and pay attention and try to be a little more honest about the things that I babble on about and really pay attention in my own way.
I think it's something we could all use a little more of in our life. Yeah. So I think we are pretty much out of time. I think we end at 6. Let me just double check to make sure I'm not cutting us off early. Yeah, we do end at 6. So this was great. I very much enjoyed our conversation. I hope everyone here did too. You had praises for my work after I presented. I want to sing my praises for your work. I think it's absolutely beautiful and mind-opening as well in terms of thinking of these, things underfoot. I think it's going to, hopefully create a mind shift in many of the people that were here. So I want to thank you for that.
Thanks. I think your work is so noble. I wish you so much success with all the things that you're doing. They're just so fantastic.
Thank you so much. And with that, I think we will close. I want to remind everyone that the final conversation is happening April 5th. So I hope you will all join us for that conversation. And thank you to Gail. And I do hope you're able to attend the talk that Terry is a part of. Unfortunately, as we said, she was ill today, so not able to attend. But hopefully you all can attend the laser talk where she'll be a member there as well.
Thank you, everybody, for spending your night with us. And thanks, Glory, for bringing us together.
Yes, thank you to the entire Thacher Gallery team who has been helping out here with us tonight.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.